Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly, an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal coaching success with over 50 episodes to date. Today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach, and for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're new, thank you so much. But if you've been with us for some time now, thank you so much all the same. I really want to preface this episode by sharing, the full title of The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success. And that is the role of experience, optimal performance practices and outcomes in the real world. And I'm sharing that to, showcase that this really is a stepping stone from The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success, which amassed around 50 episodes. So I'm so grateful we have this catalog behind us now, and it's incredibly extensive. That book really set the foundations, and so it's a bit different now because this is now the second episode in, I think, this new book series. So even though we are up to 52 episodes, can you believe, we have all of that work behind us. So it's really important to share this because for those of you who are new, I really want to encourage you to backtrack, to listen at least to a dozen of those episodes so you really understand the foundations there. And I think if you do that, you'll understand where we're going, because a lot of this work is based on those foundations in two parts. So the work in and of itself, but if you are that athlete or that player or the coach, it's building your base, so your performance or performative foundation in that respect. So we refer to it from your foundation to that baseline, or from one peak performance cycle to the next. And the secrets to optimal performance success really digged deeper to share where that comes from and how to be able to build on that. So these episodes now, it's really important to be mindful of that background, because we're going to use that to complement where we're going now, opposed to starting fresh like we did, I think, in the very beginning, or for those roughly 50 episodes. What's also really important to share, and I know I've shared this a handful of times in the past, is that this is the first time in over 8 years. And I say 8 years because that's the amount of time I've been writing specifically this work, and 11 books have come out of that to date, and the one I'm working on now is the 12th one. But this year is actually a culmination of the two. And which means is that this podcast, Beyond Top 10 Tenors, is happening in tandem with that writing. Which means that there have been a couple of crossovers in respect to sharing new insights. And when I say new, I mean the raw data that we've got that's in the works of being published for you to read and to access and to integrate and implement in your performances, your performance practices, your respective coaching pedagogies, and everything I think we've talked about in the past. However, obviously, the secrets to optimal coaching success is not about that. We're still building the foundations. But it's so important to, I think, recognize that these foundations are just as important for that, that 11, 12, 13-year-old developmental player, as we term it, and or that 23, 24-year-old elite level developmental player. And I haven't really referred to the elite in that respect in the past, but it's very important to highlight that now. And you go, why? Because we really need to recognize that you are still developing. We do like taking that humanized approach in every episode, or I try, I like that we have. And so those of you who are new, it's really about reflecting back in just real life with everything you do off court, not on court, when you are not that player, athlete, or coach in this respect. And so what this talks to and or about is that recognizing when you are that young adult, when you've gone from your late teens to your early 20s and a young adult, when you're off court, you are still developing. And we know, I think, from that growth perspective, behavioral, psychological, in this respect, you're still developing. And that's essentially why most commonly you're still referred to as a young adult, and you're still finding your way. And we do actually have some episodes that dive into that a bit more. But obviously there's a very big distinction because if you are in your early 20s and you are ranked inside the top 100, ideally, we'll get you, if not, that's okay. But if you are positioned currently inside the top 100 and you are, for argument's sake, in your early 20s, you are still developing, which is really exciting in respect to, say, if you're closer to the top 10, if you are that top 30, top 20 player, because that means the likelihood of that next peak performance cycle and the room for further peak performance cycles is incredibly large. In respect to, or in contrast to, a player that is potentially 33, 34 years of age, those next peak performance cycles aren't necessarily as readily available. That's not to say they don't have them, but more often than not, it's a level of maintenance, of maintaining that peak level. And I'm sure everyone knows who I'm referring to. The 23 Grand Slams now and counting. So it's absolutely phenomenal in that respect. However, and depending on when you listen to this, it could be more. And I'm sure that the probability of being more is quite high. But where I'm going with this is that when you are in your 30s or mid to late 30s in this case, it's a level of maintenance. And that player has reached such a high caliber, which we actually... we understand by the data, and everything that we have done actually includes these specific elite players. So we talk about the top four, which I think isn't really acknowledged enough. So specifically, the top four is obviously Djokovic as the primary active player, Nadal, who is meant to be coming back for another season, and then the other two who are retired, obviously Federer and Serena, who have all amassed 20 Grand Slam championships or more, which is incredible in its own right. And this is something that has obviously never happened in the history of our sport before. Sure, we've had players amass this number of Grand Slams in the past. However, not four players in the same era and or generation, depending how you want to term it, but all of these four players were active at the same time. And a lot of our work shares and highlights why we have top 10 players now who have not won Grand Slams, because typically in the past you had to be in serious contention to be ranked inside the top 10. So we're talking regular semi-finals appearances at Grand Slams or quarters, etc. And we do have a number of players who are inside the top 10 irrespective of what tour. That does not consistently happen, and the Grand Slams are not being shared like maybe in the past. And when I say shared, it's a little bit ironic in respect to play on words, because if you have, especially on the men's tour, that's in the last more than 60 Grand Slams, which is incredible, have been dispersed over primarily 3 players. And I know there are statistics where there have been other players from, Andy Murray to Del Potro, etc., who have been able to Wawrinka to land there. That 1, 2 or 3 Grand Slams, but primarily it's been those 3. On the women's side, however, you've had Serena in this respect, who was so dominant, and now we're seeing players such as the likes of Osaka. We had Barty, who obviously more recently retired, but then Swiatek is really starting to hold her own, and we do have that healthy level coming up with some newcomers obviously winning their maiden slams, from Gauff to Sabalenka, and we know, and Rybakina, it's very interesting when we're looking at the data to see where they're going, because believe it or not, a lot of these players leveraging our predictive analytics, we knew this was going to happen, which is incredibly exciting, because this new text, and so getting back to where I was going, is that with the podcast happening in tandem with this latest text, it really underpins and wraps up the why, and it essentially is a culmination of not just the 8 years of writing that have gotten to this point, but it kind of highlights why this Beyond Top 10 Tennis came to light, because it was due to share such landmark findings that have never happened in the sporting world before, let alone tennis. And by that, what I mean is that we have the roadmap, the pathway explicitly how to develop a top 10 tennis player. And I like to put myself in your shoes, because again, I've been there, whether it's as a player or as a coach, and from where I've grown from or evolved from since then. It's saying that if I had the answers as that 13-year-old that led the way, of course I would just grab it with, open arms. Also, the heartache a lot of you are aware of that I endured from the injuries, and some of them unfortunately I'm still dealing with to this day, and this will date me, but that's over 20 years of managing an injury, and others as well, which is very disheartening. And of course, if I know better, I want to make sure you, irrespective if you are that player or coach or parent or guardian, that you don't have to deal with the same thing, is that there are other ways. But one of, I think, the most fun facts I wanted to share today between last episode to this week's episode is that this 12th release, it'll be my 12th book, will be ready in time for Christmas. There are no specific release dates yet. I can just tell you that it will be. I will share more details in future episodes from our title and etc. And just what it's about in more detail. But what I'm happy to share now for today's episode is that yes, it is that culmination of that 8 years of writing, but it's been 11 years in development. So that's 11 years of data behind it. It's that substantial. And it actually, in fact, has also been, which is incredibly exciting, 20 years in the making, which is often unheard of. So this really goes to, I think, underscore the importance of the work, the seriousness of the work, but also that it has been an incredible journey in and of itself. So we tie that back to where this came about, where Beyond Top 10 Tennis came about, because it was just so relevant and necessary to begin to share from me to you where this has all come from, opposed to being between the pages. And obviously I'm a huge fan of that, and that's why I continue to write. But these books essentially, irrespective of what I have to say and share, it's all piggybacking off that. So they're all additional insights, like I think is shared in the intro with each and every episode. Because again, tracking back to the very beginning, it's about building that baseline and building that foundation. And that's where these books come in. They are incredibly relevant because they're guiding you along that way. And so those of you who are familiar with this, the volumes to date, so the 11 texts, specifically the 10, because that 11th one was my first fictional release. But so the 10 specific texts to date, and this one to come out will actually be the capstone, so the 11th in the series. But these are 11 texts specifically will take you from the foundations, including that 10-year pathway, which is a book in itself. So I'm Your Tennis Coaching Guru really is me saying I will be your guru, which is really a bit of fun in that respect. But on a serious note, it's saying that there's 10 years here of lessons and planners. There's no excuses. And that is how you can integrate each and every text to make that, I think, that 10 years that substantial, including the 7 keys, which are unveiled in the 7 keys to optimize your life, that uses tennis, but specifically it's talking about tennis and how to become the best tennis player in the world. But it also looked at, or it was the introduction in a manner of speaking, of that humanized approach. So even though it's very briefly discussed or shared in each episode, that book specifically was, I think, the introduction to how you can become the best tennis player in the world. But I'm also going to show you how that if you're that parent and or guardian out there, you can work in tandem with your child. You can still become the best at what you do. And we're looking at that top 10%. Of course, you're going to, for that, from formative standpoint, top 10 in the world, here you go. Or it was the initial beginning, because this current publication is all about getting into the top 10 and staying there. So it's that next step, almost that final step. But I'm very careful in saying final, because I just know there are more releases to come in the future to just shed even deeper insights. But this one is the one you've been waiting for. So the one you need for it to come full circle. And there's actually a huge chapter on that, for example. But getting back, I think, to the focus of today's episode, it's actually on problem solving and sport. And if you want to follow along, we are on page 34. But before I dive into that, I think it's very important it's the perfect episode or opportunity to show that problem solving, irrespective if it's in sport or in life, there's that humanized approach again, because it is across the board. Constantly solving problems is typically, well, for me personally, it's on a daily basis. Now, for a lot of parents and or guardians out there, it probably is for you too. For the coaches out there, I'm guaranteeing that there's a very high likelihood it's the same for you as well. For the players or athletes, if you are at that initial developmental age range, or in that age range, maybe not so much. If you are, however, in that elite developmental age range, definitely. And or that should be the case. Now, you might ask why that should be the case. Now, this comes back to when you are on court and off court, but I'll focus on court here. There's always a problem to be solved. Hopefully all the players, athletes out there are nodding your heads in agreement that there is, because tactfully, or you are looking at how you can win that next point, how you are going to break your opponent down and expose their weakness and take advantage of that. That is a problem that you are solving. And you may have solved it before stepping onto the court and it works for you on court. Or you may have solved it beforehand, but it's not working in play. So you need to adapt, you need to modify. Now, I'm sure those words are familiar. So we do have episodes previously heavily on the importance of modification. Though modification really looks at modifying your approach from that coach's perspective, or the tool so it works for the player. In this instance, modification is in the problem. And here I'm going to tap into or refer back to our episodes on education and or learning. There are ones around those topics. And the fun part here is that if you are actively engaged in another learning activity away from the court, which is great for obviously the school-aged athletes out there, but if you're not school-aged, we're going to make sure, or hopefully you are doing something else for your learning, whether that is tertiary based or otherwise. But we are looking at the ability to solve a problem from a different perspective, a different vantage point in this respect. Because if something's not working for you immediately, you really want to pull on those other skills, so your off-court skills, because they then compound your on-court skills. And there's a lot of, I think, neglect in this area, as in it is not emphasized, but it is so incredibly valuable that the more I think time or you spend engaging that side of your mind, so you're learning or you're open to that learning, so you're challenging your thinking processes, which is another topic in and of itself. It's incredibly rewarding, because the more you are challenging your thought processes, the more readily you're able to apply and or think of new approaches. Now, can get quite complex, so I'm not going to deviate there, but it's just encouraging that if there is a problem to be solved, that we actually can find the answers elsewhere from doing other activities, because inadvertently they can then help us reach the outcome we desire. Specifically when we are on court, we are really relying on our level of perception, as in what's happening at any given moment, or what we perceive is going on. But another fun proponent to that is anticipation, so our anticipatory skills. Now, both of those are different in their own right, but they can be worked on. I love the conversations around anticipation, because it's not just one-dimensional. It's not just waiting to see what your opponent is going to do next. In this case, we can really pull on our perception at the same time. That feeds directly into our anticipation. That's potentially a little bit complex, but just let it sit with you and play with it, because I'm really trying to be very mindful of not throwing in too much scientific jargon in this case. But when we are looking at problems, of course there's most can be solved, but it's again about changing the language. So we're going to get into that a bit more now, because that is a very huge secret that really underscores the secrets to optimal coaching success. So if you want to follow along again, we're on page 34. Problems come in many shapes and sizes, yet innately, the majority look at these problems as barriers rather than asking themselves, how do I solve this? By turning problems into tasks that we need to work towards and on, allows us to solve not only the problem, but affords us the opportunity to use this strain of problem solving, given that problems appear in and through a variety of situations and apply to other areas of our life, i.e. our sporting agenda. Now, hopefully what you picked up from that is something underscoring how we view problems. And this really opens up another discussion about our perspective, so our perception of an environment and or the problem and its associated, I think, facets that or attributes in this respect. And so I like to look at it as a puzzle, and the moving pieces is something I absolutely adore, and which I know is it's a fun descriptive word in this sense. But if you can fall in love with the ability to solve problems on the tennis court, you're obviously, that's in essence why you're there as a tennis player. It is that love of the sport that drives us, but also the ability to constantly and so readily solve these problems, because with each and every movement and shot that you make, there really is a problem you're looking at to solve in real time, which is incredibly fast-paced compared to if you were off court. So there is a really interesting conversation about how you can fine-tune that from a behavioral standpoint. But hold on. In order to solve problems, we first have to alter our perception of these problems and view them in the light of challenges. By changing our perception, we change our mind frame of the problem into a challenge, which is innately then viewed as achievable. And that really hints towards earlier. This slight switch in our perception allows us to surpass what the norm would perhaps argue otherwise, that which cannot be overcome, or rather solved. And I'm a big fan of this, and I love this. because it is absolutely so relevant. And the underlying tune there is that we need to switch problem into a challenge, because recall earlier where I hinted at the language being used, and this is what it's about, is that it can be so simple at times, from changing a problem to a challenge, to change our level of perception to something that is more problematic or a harder task, opposed to a challenge, something achievable, something we are up for. The challenge into being able to conquer it. So there's a very different discussion around both, and when we're able to flip the script, so switch it in this respect, and it is just so incredibly rewarding for that athlete mentality. When we have that, or we engage that side of our mentality in this respect, it really can open up, and it feeds off challenges in this respect, which can then in turn be incredibly rewarding for that athlete. Coaches have the capacity to ingrain this type of thought process into their players or athletes, but first you need to practice this concept of thought tampering yourself insofar as the way you perceive hurdles that come your way and how you proactively work at overcoming these, in contrast to accepting that as an untangible hurdle. That is a little bit complex, so let's just backtrack here. It's really about looking at the coach's perspective, training and or conditioning yourself by flipping the switch first. Thought tampering is really saying, if you're going to tamper with your mindset, let's have a look at the outcome to begin with. Let's keep an open mind, and if it is just as conducive for your player athlete, and be transparent with this, because it really is about shaping that dialogue, the language being used, and its applicability, which is such a huge piece of everything we're talking about, and it really underscores the 7 keys here. And you might think it's too simple, but I can guarantee you, oftentimes it's the simple things that really have the biggest results, and it's not about overcomplicating it. So it's about refining it. But the worst thing I think you can do is just go direct from the coach's perspective, direct to that player athlete, and then flip it. No, please do it on yourself first, to understand your own language, your own behaviors that are associated with, I think, solving problems to challenges and what happens, and to be able to be very conscious and aware of that. And then it's about planning. So the agenda that was talked about, planning in advance how this is going to be a win for that player and or athlete. And for the parents or guardians here, I really want you to pull on that triangular relationship. Those of you who are not familiar, that's obviously the parent and or guardian, the coach and the player. Now, through this relationship, it's about holding each other accountable. So especially for the parents or guardians out there, to hold the coach accountable, please, in this respect. And having an open conversation between the two of you is incredibly healthy, to see, let's change for the child then, to the player athlete, the language here, to go, we're going to perceive this not as a problem anymore. It's a challenge that we're going to face together. And something as simple as that is incredibly, and can be incredibly rewarding for that player, to looking at the barriers they may have foreseen and or even imagined in some places, and now all of a sudden they can knock them down, that they are no longer as relevant as they once used to be, and they are no longer there to stop them from moving forward, from progressing, because all of a sudden something so simple as a language switch is helping them looking at the scenario very differently. So scenario is used very loosely here, depending on the environment and the context, but also more minutely in a game-based scenario. So if they are in a match, if they're in the first round or in there at the final or somewhere in between, there are always those variances associated with problems to the player that is a problem then so the opponent in this respect, and or a part of the player's game which may be problematized, but we're going to look at it and say maybe our forehand is weaker than our backhand, which presents a bit of a challenge there on how we want to move around the court to play towards our strengths, just as a very simplified example. But if we're able to view it so simply, especially, and I really need to underscore this, especially within that developmental age spectrum, it's incredibly beneficial. Obviously, for the more elite players, irrespective if I refer to as developmental early on, it's really about this is most likely commonplace, common knowledge in this. If not, hopefully it now is, because you will face a challenge every single day of your playing career in some way, shape or form, because these are incredibly versatile, on court, off court, injuries, no injuries, the management of on court, off court. There is so much encompassed to being a professional tennis player, especially within that rankings range. And the more, I think, the closer you ascend towards the top 10, that management is so incredibly fine-tuned, because it obviously needs to be to maintain your hold inside that ranking range. However, for the players who are ranked inside the top 100, let's say towards, 99 through to 30 in the world, there are still very similar variances there. But I really want to encourage you today, if you are inside that ranking range, irrespective of what tour you're on, and we're looking at problems and solving them in ways, the step forward is implementing the 7 keys. And I can't stress that enough, because if you want to ascend closer towards the top 10, that's where it starts. There's a very, and I have insinuated this on multiple occasions in the past, that if you've been inside a ranking range for some time now, so specifically I'm talking about you've been ranked around 90 to 80 in the world for the past 1-2 seasons, or if you've been 35 in the world, you've been hovering there for the last 1, 2, 3 seasons. So I'm referring to that as a plateau in this respect, and your peak performance cycles are stagnant, so they are not happening. You've reached your peak performance, those cycles are no longer cyclical, so you have established a baseline. So refer to the beginning of today's episode. We're looking at building that initial baseline, those foundations, and up and up, so you're continuously progressing. But this isn't the case. Irrespective of your level of play, if you've reached a plateau, that means you're stagnant. And I know that's not the nicest, I think, description in this respect, but it's saying that something's got to give. And there is 99%, 0.9 I will say, likelihood, because we do like leaving that 0.01 for a variance, that you are not integrating / implementing the 7 keys. And we know that the data, we know, and recall that's amassed over 150,000 inferences, and that it has spanned now over 11 years. It is incredibly substantial. So we have the numbers there, we have the statistics, we have both qualitative and quantitative data. So please, if you are listening and you want to ascend, I'm essentially giving that to you on a platter. And those, again, if you are familiar with our episodes, you know I do love a good colloquial saying in this respect, because I do like having a bit of fun in that respect. Okay, but back to the topic about problems and solving and having that performance plateau. We know why, and you can break that cycle, and you can reach that next peak performance, and it has been done. And that is, I think, the biggest instigator to be able to accomplish that. And at the end of the day, look, if we rewind back to the pretense of today's episodes about solving a problem and having the capacity to solve problems, it's obviously problems that are incredibly versatile, irrespective if it's in play, so on court or off court, or in life. So again, with that humanized approach, and there are always, I think, different approaches you can take, but something as simple as flipping the language from a problem to a challenge can be incredibly rewarding. And look, at the end of the day, when we're looking at, I think, the differences that separate the best in the world, so the top 10, to those who are looking to ascend, whether you're ranked 900 in the world, 300 in the world, 50 in the world, it's there, that the pathway is there, which is incredibly exciting. So look, there's one problem I have solved and I'm so incredibly proud of. It is that pathway to give to you how to explicitly ascend towards the top 10 and to grab hold of a top 10 tennis ranking and stay, because that's incredibly important. That's another discussion, and I'll leave for another episode, about players who have reached that level but they have not been able to maintain that level, and it's a really interesting discussion to be had. So I'm going to wrap up today's episode on problems being solved, whether that is in life and or on the court. Beyond Top 10 Tennis is here, AMA International is here, because the answers essentially are there to make sure you are on the pathway, you are enacting the long game to ascend towards a top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode, especially, I think, the really exciting news, well, for me personally, that the book, it's on its way. And it's something that I wasn't sure if it actually was. And those of you who have listened to our episodes, you know the discussions that have been had. So thank you so much for allowing me to share that with you as well. And look, to grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success, head on over to AM8 International. That is am8international.com. For any comments or questions, head to AM8 or Topic Thread. That's the social platform set on data privacy. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn or Instagram. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. And to catch up on our blogs, head on over to Medium or directly to AMA International and look for our blogs tabs. And look, as always, I'll leave all the links in the episode notes. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That is where my fictional release is. To view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify if you're listening on one of our other platforms. Or for something left field, visit Spruik for some random polls, a bit of fun. I'd love your feedback in that respect. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. For those of you who have already done so, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. For those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AMA International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to optimize your performance to nudge you closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Places are incredibly limited, however, so look, don't be shy, come and say hi. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.